Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I'm really glad you're joining me today because, well, we've got a seriously fascinating piece of media criticism to unpack. We're going to take a hard look at modern journalism by analyzing how the mainstream media covered two vastly different news stories that happened at the exact same time. On one side, a massive, staggering financial crime. On the other, a shakeup in late-night TV. The source we're looking at today argues that how these two events were covered reveals a whole lot about our current media priorities. So let's just dive right in and see how this all breaks down. To really grasp the overarching argument here, we're going to navigate through four quick chapters. First, the $250 million scheme in Minnesota. Second, the disparities in media coverage. Third, the late-night cancellation debate. And finally, we'll ground all of this in the real-world costs. All right, let's start with Chapter 1, the $250 million scheme. $250 million. Let that number sink in for a second. According to our source material, this was the staggering cost of a COVID-19 pandemic relief fraud scheme over in Minnesota. Now, this program was called Feeding Our Future, and it was originally designed to be a federal child nutrition program. But instead, it was exploited in an incredibly lucrative scheme. The commentator really emphasizes the sheer magnitude of this crime. I mean, we're not talking about a minor administrative error here. We are talking about a massive chunk of taxpayer money being siphoned completely away from its intended purpose. Now, the consequences for this were absolutely severe. The mastermind behind all this fraud, a woman named Amy Bock, recently received a 41-year federal prison sentence. And the commentary really hammers home that specific duration to show just how extreme the gravity of this crime actually was. But how did this massive scheme unravel in the first place? Well, it turns out it points to a pretty unconventional investigation. And this is where things get really interesting. The initial legwork to uncover this wasn't done by some major news network. Nope, it was done by a 23-year-old independent content creator named Shirley. Shirley actually went on the ground in Minnesota and documented several daycare centers that appeared to be completely shut down. We're talking 0 children present. Yet, those empty centers were somehow still receiving government funding. Crazy, right? Well, his independent investigation went viral. It got boosted online by major figures like Vice President Vance and tech billionaire Elon Musk. And look, even though his original video faced some initial pushback from outlets claiming there was little evidence, Shirley was totally vindicated in the end. Federal prosecutors recently announced new charges totaling over $90 million against 15 people. That included a daycare owner featured in Shirley's viral video, Fahheima Muhammad, who was hit with a $4.6 million wire fraud charge. The source views this as a massive, real-world victory for independent, citizen-led journalism. Which brings us right to Chapter 2, disparities in media coverage. The commentator's main frustration is starkly illustrated when we look at how the New York Times was covering the culmination of this massive $250 million fraud scheme. According to a search of the Times website, they found exactly one recent article discussing a related $46 million Medicaid fraud case. But they found zero, literally zero, front-page coverage of the overarching convictions or Amy Bock's sentencing. However, at that exact same time, the media was completely consumed by a totally different story, the end of Stephen Colbert's run on CBS's Late Show. In a single 24-hour period, the New York Times published at least 12 articles about Colbert's exit. So the commentary uses this stark numerical contrast, one article on a massive taxpayer fraud versus 12 articles on a TV show ending, to argue that modern editorial priorities are severely skewed toward entertainment over impactful local reporting. The commentary also takes issue with how the few reports that did exist were framed. They point specifically to a CNN headline about the fraud's mastermind. Remember that 41-year prison sentence we just talked about? Well, the CNN headline phrased it as a 500-month prison sentence. Now, this is neutrally observed by our source as a highly unusual editorial choice. Think about it. Outside of talking about a baby's age, people naturally measure long periods of time in years, not months. The commentary suggests that choosing 500 months instead of 41 years downplays the severity of the sentence, indicating a lack of serious engagement with just how grave this story really is.
Moving on to Chapter 3, the late-night cancellation debate.
So the commentary highlights that the mainstream media gave Colbert's departure an incredibly high level of emotional weight, like a lot of weight. For example, they point to a tribute from CNN's Anderson Cooper. During a broadcast, Cooper actually compared Colbert's time on late-night TV to a quote from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. He specifically likened the show to when Samwise Gamgee and Frodo Baggins were crawling through Mordor toward Mount Doom. This is presented by the source to showcase what they view as a dramatic overreaction by the press to, a late-night comedian losing his time slot. But beyond just the emotional tributes, the analysis highlights how the media immediately framed the cancellation as a sort of political conspiracy. They point to a video from CNN's Jake Tapper, who theorized that the cancellation wasn't just a standard network decision, but actually politically motivated. Tapper suggested that the new owners, resulting from the CBS and Paramount merger, were trying to appease Donald Trump by removing a host who criticized him pretty frequently. Now, that media speculation is then contrasted with Donald Trump's actual public reaction to the news. Over on Truth Social, Trump posted, "I absolutely love that Colbert got fired. I hear Jimmy Kimmel is next. May they all rest in peace." The source notes that, sure, Trump is clearly celebrating the end of the show and taking a rhetorical victory lap here, but, they argue, there is no actual evidence he ordered the firing or influenced the corporate merger at all. The overarching argument is that the media's assumption of some vast political conspiracy is entirely misplaced. To counter that political narrative, the commentator presents a very practical counterargument based purely on economics. Let's break down the business side of this. It's estimated that with a staff of roughly 200 people living in high-cost areas like New York, standard salaries alone would cost the network at least $16 million a year. Then, add Stephen Colbert's reported $15 million annual host salary on top of that. But most importantly, reports indicate that the show was actively bleeding money, losing up to $40 million a year amidst declining ratings. So, the commentator argues, you really don't need a political conspiracy to explain why a TV network would cancel a show losing $40 million annually. It is simply a standard bottom-line business decision. And finally, we arrive at Chapter 4, the real-world costs. This is where the argument is grounded in a truly sobering, tragic reality. While dissecting the Minnesota fraud cases, a very specific consequence of the theft is brought to light. According to the records, a Medicaid patient who required 24-hour care received absolutely no services for months. A neighbor eventually went to check on him, but sadly, he was found dead. The horrifying detail pointed out here: just one day before this man died alone, the fraudster assigned to him had attempted to bill the government for services they never even provided. If those taxpayer funds had been used correctly, well, that man might still be alive today. So this isn't just about moving numbers around on a spreadsheet, right? It is quite literally a matter of life and death. Which brings us to the conclusion of our explainer today, and leaves us with one seriously provocative question. When we look at these two stories side by side, a massive $250 million scheme where taxpayers are defrauded and vulnerable people actually lose their lives, versus an underperforming late-night television show ending, what does it say about the state of our media when the TV show dominates the front page? We're left to ponder whether our modern journalistic priorities are really serving the public interest, or if they're simply chasing entertainment. It is absolutely a powerful question to reflect on. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this source material today. I can't wait to explore our next topic with you soon.